Every morning, I parked my old Toyota in the same spot at the end of the lot, the one nobody wanted because the paint on the curb had worn away and the shade from the one skinny tree did nothing when the sun was directly overhead. I liked that spot anyway. It meant I didn't have to walk past the row of shiny sedans and hear the comments. But of course I still did, because the accounting department was on the third floor and the elevator was always broken. And the stairs went right past the front windows where everyone could see the parking lot like it was a stage. My name is Rachel Moore. I was 30 years old, and I had been working as an accountant at the same mid-size firm for almost 6 years. I kept my head down. I did my job well. I reconciled the numbers. I caught the errors nobody else caught. I stayed late when the quarterly reports were due and left quietly when they weren't. I was, by most definitions, invisible. I liked being invisible. Invisible people don't get laughed at, or so I thought, until I realized that invisibility doesn't protect you from people like Amanda Scott. Amanda was 33, 3 years older than me, and she worked 2 desks down in client relations. She had a way of making everything about money. Not the numbers themselves. Not the spreadsheets or the interest rates or anything I actually cared about, but whose money, and how much of it, and who had more, and who had less. She talked about her new handbag before she took her coat off in the morning. She talked about the restaurant she went to on Friday before she'd even said hello. And she talked often and loudly about my car. "Oh my God, Rachel, is that thing even street legal anymore?" She said once, loud enough that 3 people in the break room turned around. I just smiled and stirred my coffee, the cheapest one from the vending machine, the kind that costs less than $1 and tastes like it, and I didn't say anything because what was there to say? She wasn't wrong. My car was old. It had a dent in the back bumper from a shopping cart in a parking lot 2 years ago that I never bothered to fix. The air conditioning worked only if you hit the dashboard at the right angle. It was embarrassing by her standards. One of them, I don't even remember which one exactly, maybe it was Amanda. Maybe it was one of the people who laughed along with her because that's easier than not laughing, called it embarrassing to my face. Not about me. About the car. As if the two things were separate, as if a person could be judged and their belongings could be judged, and somehow that wasn't the same thing at all. I remember standing there in the parking lot, keys in my hand, listening to the laughter fade as they got into their nicer cars and drove off toward lunches I didn't attend, and I remember thinking that none of them had any idea what that car had done for me. None of them knew what I had traded for it. None of them had ever asked. That's the thing about people who talk about money all the time. They rarely understand it. They understand spending it. They understand displaying it. But they don't understand what it means to hold on to something quietly, to build something in the dark where no one is watching, to choose the cheap coffee and the old car and the modest apartment not because you have no other option but because you have a plan. And the plan requires patience. And patience requires that you let people believe whatever they want to believe about you. I had been saving for years. Not in some dramatic way, not with any single lucky break, just methodically, the way I did everything. I read everything I could get my hands on about markets and small business finance on my lunch breaks, the ones where everyone assumed I was just sitting alone because nobody invited me anywhere. I ran numbers for a business plan on nights and weekends, tucked into a notebook I kept in my bag, the same bag I carried every day, worn at the corners, another thing Amanda liked to comment on. I met with a small business advisor twice a month before work, arriving at 6 in the morning so it wouldn't interfere with my job. I did all of this while everyone around me assumed that the woman with the old car and the cheap coffee simply didn't have any money, and I let them assume it, because their assumptions were none of my business, and my plans were none of theirs. The conflict never really went away. It just repeated itself, week after week, month after month. My coworkers were absolutely convinced I was poor. Not struggling, not modest, but poor in the specific way people use that word when they want to feel superior without saying it outright. They laughed about my clothes, always the same handful of blazers rotated carefully. They laughed about my lunches, usually something I packed myself in a container that had lost its lid years ago and now just balanced with a plate on top. They laughed, most of all, about the Toyota, parked in its shady, unwanted corner, quietly outliving every joke made about it. I want to be honest and say that it did wear on me. I'm not made of stone. There were nights I sat in my apartment, that same modest apartment nobody had ever seen, running the numbers again just to reassure myself that I wasn't crazy, that this was actually working, that the discomfort of being underestimated was buying me something real. There were mornings I sat in my car in that parking spot a little longer than necessary, not ready yet to walk past the windows and hear whatever new comment waited for me that day. I was quiet, but quiet doesn't mean numb. It just means I decided a long time ago that my energy was better spent building something than defending myself to people who had already made up their minds. Then, 6 months before everything changed, I did something nobody expected. I quit. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't stand up in the middle of the office and give a speech about everyone who had ever doubted me, even though there were nights I imagined exactly that, word for word, in vivid detail, mostly out of frustration rather than any real desire to follow through. Instead, I wrote a 2-week notice, handed it to my manager on a Tuesday morning, and when people asked what I was doing next, I just said I was taking some time to figure things out. Amanda laughed about that too, I heard later, said something like maybe she's finally trading in that car for a bicycle, and a few people laughed along, the way they always did. What I was actually doing was signing a lease on a small office space above a dry cleaner on the other side of town, a space with cracked linoleum and a window that didn't close all the way, but a space that was mine. I was filing paperwork to start my own financial consulting company, the kind of company built specifically to help small business owners and individuals who had been ignored or overcharged by bigger firms, the kind of people who reminded me, more than a little, of myself before any of this started. I used the savings I had built quietly for years. I used the relationships I had made with that small business advisor and a handful of early clients who trusted me because I had done honest work for them on the side, informally, for almost 2 years before I ever left my job. None of my former coworkers knew any of this. They didn't ask. They had already decided who I was, and it apparently wasn't someone worth asking questions about. The first few months were hard in the way that starting anything real is hard. I worked longer hours than I ever had at the accounting firm, except now every hour felt like it belonged to something I had chosen rather than something I was simply enduring. I drove the same Toyota to meetings with potential clients, and more than once I caught someone glancing at it in a parking lot the way Amanda used to, and more than once I let them glance. Because I had learned by then that what people think about your car has very little to do with what you're actually capable of. Word moves strangely through a small industry, and even stranger through the halls of an old office where people never stop talking about who's doing what. It took about 6 months for the news to make its way back to my former coworkers, the way news like that always does, second-hand and slightly wrong at first, then corrected. Then repeated with wide eyes in the break room I used to sit in quietly with my cheap coffee. Rachel Moore, the quiet one, the one with the old car, had started her own financial company. Not just started it, but grown it, faster than anyone expected, with a small but sharp team and a growing list of clients who spoke well of the honest, careful work being done for them. I hadn't set out to prove anything to anyone. I had simply built the thing I always intended to build. But I won't pretend it didn't feel like something, hearing that the same people who mocked my car were now the ones asking around about how I'd done it. And then, almost as if the story had decided to write its own ending, my company posted an opening. A junior position, client-facing, the kind of role that required someone sharp with numbers but also good with people, someone who understood both sides of the table. Applications came in the way they always do, a stack of resumes and cover letters, some strong, some forgettable. And then one afternoon, going through the list of scheduled interviews for the week, I saw a name that stopped me for a moment. Amanda Scott. I sat with that for a while before the interview. Not with anger, though I won't pretend there wasn't some old, worn-down version of that feeling still sitting somewhere inside me. Mostly, I sat with something closer to curiosity, and maybe a small, quiet kind of amusement at how life arranges itself sometimes. How the woman who used to laugh at my dented bumper in a parking lot was now sitting in my waiting room, straightening her blazer, hoping to be hired by the company I built. When she walked into my office, I watched her face carefully. There was a flicker, just a flicker of recognition, followed almost immediately by something like disbelief, and then, to her credit, an attempt to smooth it all over into a professional smile. She sat down across from me the way any candidate would, and for a moment neither of us said anything about the past. I think we both understood there was no need to. I want to be clear about what I did next, because it would have been easy, almost satisfying in a shallow way, to use that moment for something other than what it was meant to be. I could have asked pointed questions designed to embarrass her. I could have brought up the car, the coffee, the comments in the break room, could have watched her squirm the way I used to have to swallow my own discomfort in silence. I didn't do any of that. I conducted the interview the exact same way I conducted every other interview that week, with the same questions, the same attention, the same fairness I would have given a total stranger. I asked about her experience with client accounts. I asked how she would handle a disagreement with a difficult customer. I asked her to walk me through a time she had to correct a mistake under pressure. I listened closely, the way I always listen, because the work matters more to me than anything else that happened in that old office years ago. And the truth, the plain and simple truth, is that she wasn't the strongest candidate. Not because of who she used to be, not because of anything personal, but because her answers lacked the specific kind of precision and steadiness the role demanded. The same qualities I had spent years building in myself while she spent those same years commenting on other people's finances instead of managing her own career with any real depth. It wasn't close. Another candidate that week had a clearer grasp of the technical work and a calmer way of handling pressure, and I hired that person instead. I called Amanda myself to let her know. I kept it simple and professional, the same way I would with anyone. I thanked her for her time, told her the decision came down to fit with the specific requirements of the role, and wished her well. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I wondered if she was putting together the pieces of who I really was and who I had become, and then she thanked me quietly and hung up. I don't know what she thought about the car after that. I never asked. It didn't matter anymore. There's a small detail I never told anyone at that old firm, something that made the whole thing feel almost circular in a way I couldn't have planned even if I'd tried. The office I finally rented, the one above the dry cleaner with the cracked linoleum and the window that never closed all the way, was only a 15-minute drive from the accounting firm where I used to work. Some mornings, in those early days, I would drive past the old building on my way to a client meeting, and I would see the same row of shiny cars parked out front, and somewhere in that row, my old spot at the far edge, empty now. Waiting for whoever inherited the shade of that one skinny tree. I never felt the urge to gloat. Mostly, I just felt a strange kind of gratitude, the sort that only comes after you've been through something hard enough to actually appreciate the other side of it. Building a company from nothing teaches you things no accounting job ever could, even one you're good at. It teaches you what it means to sign your name to a lease that terrifies you a little. It teaches you to make payroll before you pay yourself, to sit with a client who is angry about a mistake that wasn't even yours and fix it anyway because your name is now attached to every piece of advice that leaves your office. It teaches you the particular exhaustion of explaining, over and over, why a young company with an unfamiliar name deserves the same trust as one that's been around for decades. I did all of that with the same quiet persistence I used to bring to spreadsheets and reconciliations, except now the numbers were mine, the risk was mine, and so, eventually, was the reward. I hired slowly and carefully. My first employee was a woman named Priya, a sharp former analyst who had been overlooked at her previous firm the same way I had been overlooked at mine, though for different reasons entirely. She used to joke that she took the job partly because I interviewed her in jeans and an old cardigan and didn't seem to care that she showed up on the bus instead of in a car at all. I told her I understood exactly what that felt like, and I meant it more than she probably realized. We built the client list together, one careful relationship at a time, the kind of relationships that don't come from flashy marketing but from doing the work honestly and doing it well, year after year, the same way I'd learned to do everything. By the time word finally reached my old office, the company had grown into something I was genuinely proud of, not because of its size, which was still modest by most standards, but because of what it represented. Every client we took on was someone who had been dismissed somewhere else, someone who had been told their business was too small to matter or their questions were too basic to deserve real attention. I built the whole thing around the opposite idea, that everyone deserves careful, honest financial guidance regardless of how much money they currently have, because money, more than almost anything else, is about where you're headed, not where you happen to be standing today. It's older now, a little more worn, a little more stubborn about starting on cold mornings. I could afford something else easily, something newer, something that would turn heads in that same parking lot I used to park in on the far edge in the shade of that one skinny tree. But I never got rid of it, not out of stubbornness, and not to make some kind of point either. I kept it because it reminds me of exactly who I was during the years nobody believed in me, and exactly what quiet, patient work can build when no one is paying attention. People used to laugh at that car in the mornings, back when I was just the quiet accountant with the cheap coffee nobody thought twice about. Now, every so often, someone from those days reaches out asking for advice, or a reference, or occasionally, quietly, for a job. I answer every message the same way I conducted that interview, with honesty and fairness, nothing more and nothing less. Because if there's one thing I learned from all of it, from the laughing, from the years of silence, from building something real out of nothing anyone else could see, it's this. Never judge someone's future by the car they drive today.